Well, good morning. I'm Cate, CWNE number 181.
And I'm François, Vergès, CWNE number 180.
Yeah, François, I've been meaning to ask, and maybe it's a good time, better than any, to ask, how did you get number 180 and I got 181?
I either get a faster computer or I click faster on the send button.
Okay, all right. Well, maybe
Sorry,
so.
Glenn.
Well, you know, that's one thing, there's a difference between two of us, but you know, there's something else a little different between us, and it's like where we live. And so I'm from the South, and where I speak Southern Redneck, and you are from the North Ontario, but it's interesting, you have this beautiful French accent, so I don't think you were born originally there. I understand, Francois, you were born in the home of spicy mustard. Is this correct?
Yes, I was born in Dijon, France, and we actually call it the mustard. Right?
Okay.
And your mustard, we call it the American mustard.
Okay, well, wonderful. So,
what about you? Yeah, I understand you were born in St. Petersburg, Russia, right?
St. Petersburg, Russia. No, not St. Petersburg, Russia, but St. Petersburg, Florida. Our home, the founder of the city was from St. Petersburg, Russia, by the way. So we have quite a few things that are different between us. And, you know, I'm not even going to bring up the age thing, okay? So let's not talk about that. However, you know, there is one thing that kind of unifies us, and that's the fact that we've had quite a bit of experience of talking about warehouse Wi-Fi. In fact, it's not just warehouse Wi-Fi, it's the wild, weird, wacky world of warehouse Wi-Fi, because there's so many design challenges. It really makes that an interesting and a challenging vertical to work with.
All right, so let's start by defining what a warehouse is.
Okay, so what is a warehouse? Well, it's a building or part of one for the storage of goods and merchandise. Another definition you can look at here is it's a building that's where you store and where wholesalers keep large amounts of merchandise. You can also look at it as a verb because it's a place where items are stored or deposited in a warehouse. And I kind of like this fourth definition I found, thankyoudictionary.com. It's where you can find the mentally ill to large institutions for long-term custodial care. I'm thinking this is what happens to a Wi-Fi engineer before they have the training in doing Wi-Fi engineering for a warehouse, all right? But I think the best definition is this. And it is a large building that presents a Wi-Fi design challenge, but it can be met by a well-equipped and trained Wi-Fi professional. So as we're looking at different types of warehouses, Francois, what are the different types of warehouses that you've looked at and that you've actually done surveys in?
So we identified three main families of warehouses here, and this is what you will find typically if you work in warehouses. The first family will be the distribution centers. Right? Distribution centers, usually it's large warehouses. Think about Amazon and all big retail companies, they would have their distribution centers. So you typically have higher ceilings, a lot of aisles, can be narrow aisles. And you have a lot of traffic, so a lot of lift trucks. You have to be careful about that. It might be a 24/7-hour building type of thing. So what's challenging for us is when are we going to work? We need to coordinate our work with the workers on site so we don't interfere with their work. Sometimes I've worked overnight in those type of warehouses sometimes. It's just easier for us to do the work. And they can also have outdoor spaces. They put their stock outside. Sometimes they want coverage outside, so it's something to keep in mind as well for distribution centers. And then they would have like loading docks where all the trucks comes in, and you have the goods coming in and outside of the building all day long. Second big family would be the production centers or the factories. And so these type of warehouses, the shape of the building, what they have inside will depend, big it depends, right? But it will depend on what they're producing, right? Are they producing electronics? Are they producing cars? Are they producing food, right? So all of this will impact the environment. But you could find heavy machinery. So heavy machinery for us, it means that it's not always easy to survey. You have to go around. Maybe you have to do a combination of continuous site survey and stop and go in order to get your data. you can have more open spaces. You don't have as much racking, or you could have a combination of racking and machinery. So different type of environments within the same warehouse. Sometimes it can be a large building, and the ceiling height will depend on what you're producing. If you're producing like a car or a big product, you're going to have a big warehouse. If you're producing wine or something like that, you have big warehouses as well. And also the height of the ceiling might vary where you are in the warehouse. So in some spaces in the warehouse, you have high ceilings. In other places, you have low ceilings. So just keep that in mind. Third big family is the retail. So retail, think about grocery stores, hardware stores, IKEA. IKEA has its own definition.
Yeah. And you know, François, I was just thinking, we sometimes don't think of retail stores being warehouse, but you know, they fit the characteristics of a warehouse. High ceilings, large coverage areas, shelving, so it really fits the category of when doing a design for a warehouse.
And if you think about it, usually the structure of the building will be the same as a typical warehouse. That's why I put it in this category. And they will have public and private spaces. So public would be like where everyone goes to buy the stuff. Private will be the backstage. If you're in a grocery stores, you have like fridges and other things you have to think about. For a hardware store, they'll have like rackings, sometimes outdoor spaces. And typically the ceilings are lower in this type of warehouses.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so François, are we ready to discuss the details of a warehouse right now?
No, we're not quite ready.
We're not ready, yeah. But just before we do, we got to do a little work up here on stage, so let's give you a discussion topic to talk about among yourselves for just a minute. Should we call it code channel contingent or code channel interference? Discuss among yourselves, we'll be right back. I don't do any discussion.
I'm ready, Glenn.
Hold it. I've got a little bit more to do back here, François. Okay, we are now ready to talk about warehouse Wi-Fi. You know, as we talk about the importance of working in a warehouse, this is a topic that is probably different from doing a hospital or a cube farm in an office park. This has some different things that we looked about. Of course, safety first is important, right? And we'll talk about our PPE in just a minute. But safety rules are critical at a warehouse. Often you have to take a seminar before you can even do your survey. So put that into your planning schedule. It may take you another half day or day to do your warehouse Wi-Fi work. So just keep that in mind. Insurance. Well, you don't need insurance. You do too. Make sure if they ask you if you have a certificate of insurance, provide that for them. Or if you're with the VAR, be sure that they have their proper liability insurance up to date at that place. And you may need an escort when you do your work. If so, that's going to take your survey longer. Keep these things in mind. Warehouse safety rules. Forklifts have the right-of-way. Has anyone ever been in a warehouse, been run over by a forklift? Well, you wouldn't be here if you were. But they drive crazy and realize it's their space. So I give them the protection and the distance they need. Sometimes they beep when they go around a corner. Sometimes the beeper isn't working. So just keep that in mind. Walk in the designated paths are usually lined in a warehouse. Know what those are. Don't go out of those designated paths. And which means you might have to go an off hour to do your survey work. Slippery floors, loud machinery, keep those things in mind. And François, you put an interesting note here. What do you mean by your red note at the bottom?
Yeah, so this is something I keep in mind when I do work in a warehouse. Always respect the workers. So you entering their workspace. So this is important to keep in mind. It's kind of like if you were working at home and then someone was just bringing the head between you and your screen. It's interfering in your work. You don't want that. So you always want to respect the workers. And I found that if you respect the workers, they give it back to you and you end up spending a good time in the warehouse. So you get the work done and you spend a good time. So win-win.
Yeah. Okay, and when we talk about personal protective equipment, be sure you know what that is and be sure you use it. Eye protection, hearing protection, hard hat, safety shoes are required. reflective vests in some places. If it's food or cold storage, you may have to have a protective suit. Hair protector, identification badge may be delayed. So there's lots of different things about personal protective equipment. Just a real quick story. I was on a site and I went outside of the office area, and before I got 50 feet, I had 2 employees point at me and they did this. I didn't have my hearing protection in. So the employees know if you're not wearing your stuff. If you don't think, well, I don't need to use my personal protection equipment. Well, you may have a very short site survey, okay? They may escort you off site. Use the personal protective equipment. They provide it for a reason, and you need to use it. And by the way, if the graphic of this individual with the mask on looks like anybody up on the stage here this morning, is a mere coincidence, okay? Francois, what about safety measures? What can we do to protect our equipment? I mean, we've got our laptops, we've got our equipment set up, so what can we do to protect that stuff?
So we could use cones like this. So if you're doing an AP on a stick and you place your AP, you can use a cone to let everyone know that you're working here. I've worked in warehouses where whenever we needed to work on one specific aisle, they had a little chain with a stop sign, and we needed to pretty much close the aisle while we were working in a specific aisle. Also, something that's not easy in warehouses is whenever you're working with your laptop and you need to leave it somewhere, you don't have anywhere to put it. So just be careful where you put your stuff and how you protect that. You can put it on the floor. Sometimes you find boxes. I put it on boxes. And never assume it's safe, right? In warehouses, it's better to be safe than sorry. So you don't want to damage some equipment or attract too much attention. So just be safe with what you have. If you have a sidekick, just make sure the cable is nice and neat. If you have your dongles, make sure everything is nice and protected.
Sometimes I've even done this. I've used signage, and I put a sign. If I'm with this VAR, whatever. If you have a question about this equipment, call this phone number. I have my cell phone number, and put a little blurb about your VAR doing the work. The other thing is skyjack, boom lifts, sky lifts. They're called many different things. Get and obtain your own certification for doing this. I've got a link down the bottom. Sunbelt, which is a big certification, it's a rental company in the U.S. and Canada. They will give you a 1-day certification training. It's about $100, and it's good for 7 years. The client may require you to do your own on-site training, so just keep that in mind. And there's other companies that provide this lift certification too. But if you have your own lift certification, that may give you a leg up with this company. They'll say, oh, okay, well, at least you've got some certification. If you have never been in a skylift, if you have never been in one of those lifts that goes 35 feet up in the air, and if you have a fear of heights, I'm not trying to be funny here, you need to know how to use a skylift because you're going to need to put your antenna up there for measurement. So keep that in mind. Get some training on that. And that's a good thing. Again, we've talked about a lot about safety, before we even really talk about Wi-Fi design in a warehouse. But these are big things. And like other verticals, you need to know this stuff before you get started.
And also pro tip about skyjacks. Usually they would have one on site to change the light bulb or something. So you could ask them if you could use it. And if they don't have any, you're gonna have to bring, and you need one, you're gonna have to bring your own and then rent one. So make sure you plan those costs in your planning as well.
Right. And so there's other devices that we use in a warehouse, Francois. So what are some of those things?
Yeah, so specific to warehouses, we have a lot of handheld RF guns. So it's usually devices like these ones running Windows CE. You also have forklifts. So forklifts will have like a little embedded computer on top of the forklift, and the workers will use them. You could have VoIP phones. So for the phones, you could have like dedicated like Cisco VoIP phones, or I've seen Android rugged phones. For the guns, usually it's a low bandwidth. They're using low bandwidth applications to update the database warehouse management system. And in warehouses, it's not uncommon to see more APs than clients. You have a large amount of APs, and you could see, I've seen controllers with less client than APs. So. It's not typically a high-density environment.
Yeah, but there are RF challenges when we look at a warehouse, and some of those are these. You need to provide coverage throughout the entire warehouse. That makes sense, right? Choose the proper antennas, and we're going to be talking a bit more about antenna choice Omni versus patch antennas in just a few minutes. Layer 1 interferences. Some of these real high-tech warehouses will maybe just blank out the 2.4 gigahertz band. So be sure you're doing a layer 1 analysis as well as layer 2. And then what type of product is on the shelves? Is it cat food? Or is it metal oil drums that's lots of reflection, or is it like cat food absorbs your RF signal? So know what your product is. And so that's another RF challenge when we look at warehouses.
All right, so if we start, we presented what a warehouse is, the different characteristics, what you need to think about when you design, or when you will be working in a warehouse environment. So let's talk about design a little bit. Glenn, do you want to introduce this one?
Sure, and this is preliminary work, and this really isn't too unusual from any other vertical. You're going to talk about the overall requirements, gather that information from your clients, gather statistics. Again, there's a great reference in the CWDP study guide, page 360, talks about questions you need to ask stakeholders and questions you need to use as you do a walkthrough. So be familiar with those things. Organize your survey work, but more than anything is know how the end users are using Wi-Fi. You're not setting the Wi-Fi up for your characteristics and what you want it to do. You want the Wi-Fi to work for those end users. So get to know the end users, talk with them, and be familiar with how they're going to be using Wi-Fi.
And I used to say warehouse. I like to say warehouses are like snowflakes. They are different. They're all different in their own way. So I would advise to never design a warehouse without going on site at least once. So what about predictive survey? Like, do we want to do a predictive survey for warehouse? So I would say yes, if we feed the survey software with the proper information. Right? When you go on site, you get the proper information, and then you can feed that information to the software. I usually tell the story about this one time I designed a warehouse, and the customer brings me in, and then the warehouse was empty. So I could see the height of the ceiling. That's pretty much all I had. And so they gave me the layout of the racking, and I did my design based on that. And then when I went back on site to validate, half of the racking were like 3 meter high, the other one was 10 meter high. And I didn't think about all of that in my design, so we had to take down a couple of APs to make it work. So predictive design can work in a warehouse if you go on site and you know exactly what the environment would look like. What's great about a predictive design, you can test different antennas, test the orientation of the antenna. You can model the racking using attenuation areas. And you can do a sensitivity analysis. So this means that you could change the attenuation of your racks and see how this will affect your design. Right? You want to be in a distribution center, especially. You want to make sure that your design will work, whether your warehouse is full or empty. And you want to make sure that the amount of goods in the racking will not impact your design too much.
Great. And when we talk about the different types of antennas, is it omnidirectional, is it directional? Well, this is not a hard and fast rule, but if you're over 20 feet, if you're 20 feet or under, you could probably use an omnidirectional antenna. Again, you want to test, when you do your site survey work. If it's over 30 feet or 10 meters, consider using a directional antenna. And there's some examples in the graphic there, what an omnidirectional antenna look like. And then you can see the coverage that you get with the directional antenna. The directional antenna can also be used as you shoot up and down the aisles. It can also have with a smaller DBI, like a 4 DBI patch antenna, which is omnidirectional, but it shoots the signal stronger down to the floor when you look at the radiation pattern. And that's another thing, Francois, I think we really need to emphasize here. Know your radiation patterns of your antennas. Print them out, be familiar with them, understand the directional output and the beam width. And you say, well, sometimes I have a hard time looking what the beam width looks like. And so here's a Keith Parsons trick. I saw one of his videos. You make some paper cones and you take them with you. So this one just happens to be a 60-degree I can see you all in there. 60-degree cone. So that would be like azimuth in one way, but if you want to do elevation, you fold it this way and you can do 120. I mean, simple cone to take with you. If you have conceptual, like most of us would probably have a hard time using our hands and say, well, what is exactly 60 degrees? This is 60 degrees, and this is 120. And I've got another one here for 30 and 60. Simple tools to keep, not really high tech, but it'll give you an idea of what your directional antennas are looking like. The predictive models are great for studying antenna patterns, as Francois just said. So make some of these when you're doing your survey work, and they'll give you a big leg up as you're trying to find out how is that antenna probably going to project. One other thing, as we look at antennas here, remember, this is 30 or 60 degrees, and this is a 3 dB cutoff. Remember, it's 3 dB down. That doesn't mean your signal, boom, drops off the face of the earth, okay? It's less than 3 dB. Just remember that you want to put the majority of your clients in this beam width. However, that doesn't mean they're not going to have any connectivity at all. But remember, this is just gives you a good idea of what the beam width will look like.
And predictive models are great to study the antenna pattern. So if you have the wrong orientation, you will see it right away in your predictive design.
So Francois, you've done a lot of work AP on a stick, probably more than I have. I've done more of the predictive and the post-analysis. So tell me, what are some of the tips and trades and things that you do when you do AP on a stick survey?
Yeah, so AP on a stick survey in a warehouse is relevant for different reasons. First one is you have an environment that can be challenging, high ceilings, narrow aisles, open spaces, big machineries, and so on. The AP on a stick also allows you to test different type of antennas, different orientation, different angles, and also it allows you to inspect the mounting options, right? What does the ceiling looks like? Am I going to be able to install an AP? What does a wall look like, and so on, right? So it gives you a better sense of the environment and help you to see how the RF will play around in the environment. And also you could do your AP on a stick measurements and then import that data into your model, your predictive model, in order to refine your predictive model. So the question here is, how do you mount an AP if you have a high ceiling? Right? How do you temporarily mount an AP? The first one on the right is, it's actually a pole. It's a Manfrotto tripod. It can go up to 25 feet. It's made out of aluminum, so it's light, you can carry it around. I like it very much, it's fast. I use a Wi-Fi stand on top of it, and it works great. You leave the battery on the floor, and then you're good to go. The only drawback is that it's pretty large, so you cannot use it indoor, like in the office's environment, and you cannot really travel with it. You'll have to ship it and so on. The one in the center is a skyjack. The skyjack option, I like it. You install your pole on the skyjack, and then you can raise the skyjack from the ground, and then you can walk around. This allows you to do your work alone. Sometimes you have someone with you, but if you're alone, you can get it done with a skyjack. Just make sure you can raise the platform from the ground. The third option is the lift truck. So in some aisles, it would be too narrow for a skyjack, so we'll need a lift truck. And then the lift truck, you'll need a driver, right, in order to operate it. So you'll have someone, yeah?
Yeah, I was going to say, you've got three options here, and these are great options. But, you know, Francois, you snuck in a little slide here about a fourth option of mounting an AP.
Yeah, these are old school options, right? What about drones? That would be great, right? Just install the AP on the drone, maybe a battery, and then let the drone go up.
Yeah, you know, we laugh, but we wonder if this drones are not going to be an option in the site survey field in the future.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone's really used them now, but drones are becoming more and more popular, more and more. Look at a TV program now. You'll see drone footage on almost every remote shot. So I think drones are becoming something we can actually use in the Wi-Fi survey market.
Couple challenges with drone is battery life. Typically, they don't have like hours of battery life, it's like 30 minutes or so. And also the weight of the AP. You need like a beefy drone in order to be able to support that weight. And if you want to bring the battery with the AP, yeah. So we'll see in the future. I'm not producing hardware, but I know companies producing hardware. Maybe think about it. Also, what you can do with Skyjacks, you can install the antenna directly on the Skyjack, so this allows you to test different orientation and angles. That's a great idea. I got this from Stu in Canada, Vancouver. So for your AP, when you do AP on a stick, you would want to configure your AP as a standalone AP. So for Cisco, it could be autonomous. You have to change the code of the firmware, so it could be autonomous or Mobility Express for the newer APs. We didn't put too much details here, but we have guides that we can refer you guys to in order to do that. For Aruba, you could use instant AP. Each vendor will have their own version of the autonomous AP you could use to do an AP on a stick. Usually, I like to configure one SSID per band, so it's easier for me to do my work and my analysis afterwards. And you adjust your transmit power just like how you would install it in your final design.
And now, Francois, our next slide is going to go through your methodology plans. Again, you've got lots of experience through AP on a Stick survey, and I really appreciate the step-by-step you look at a warehouse, because as you just mentioned, every warehouse is a snowflake, right? So they're different, but there's different characteristics to look at. So I'm really interested about how you're going to share your methodology about sizing up a warehouse and how you do your AP on a Stick design.
Okay, so this is the methodology I use usually. So this is a typical warehouse. First thing you do, you define the different profiles and layouts you have in your environment, right? So in this case, we have a mezzanine, 8-foot ceiling, two levels. They had another mezzanine, different height, 11-foot ceiling, two levels as well. They had narrow aisles at the back, but very high racks, 24 feet high, and then the rest was just racking. Same environment, 24 feet high, and they had open areas. They also had the offices that I didn't have here. You could have as many, environment as you want. Some warehouses are closed environment. If they do like painting, if they need the temperature to be lower, so we have like a big fridge. So just define these different areas. If you do an AP on the stick, second step is I would take 3 or 4 measurements per area just to understand what the propagation of the signal would be in these different areas. So in an open area, in the narrow racks, in the mezzanine, in the other mezzanine, and then for the racks, I would do like depending on what they have in the racks, right? This will attenuate your signal. You'll have different attenuations, so I would do maybe more than 3. If you need to do more than 3 or 4, just take the time to take the measurements so you know how the signal will be through your different racks environment. Once you have that, you can build the model from this AP on a stick measurements. So that's where you could go back to your predictive model, feed the information that you gathered, and then have your overall design. And so at the end of step 3, you have all the AP locations. Right? And another step that's important for warehouse is validate the mounting option. So once you have your location, it's easy to put a dot on a PDF file, but if you go back on site, you might have something on the ceiling, right? Especially in warehouses, I've noticed that if you go to the last aisle, that's typically where they have all the air ducts and all of these things. So I try to avoid the last aisle now. But you go back on site and check the mounting options, right? Can I install the AP where the dot is on my PDF file? Yes, no. If no, if you have to modify it, you move it. Does it impact the rest of my design? And so you adjust your design that way, just to make sure that the installer will be able to install the AP.
Yeah. And François, when we talk about mounting options, you've got some great methodology here, but for the practical level, the I-beams are 40 feet up in the air. Yeah. How do you mark those so that a cable installer knows, hey, where to pull the cable and how to mount the AP?
Yeah, so you could guide the work for the installers. If you help the installers, they will help you back, right? So always try to make it easier for them, and then it will make your work easier as well. So a couple tips I've used, pink ribbon like this, you can buy it at Home Depot, whatever. And then I use a Sharpie to just name or put the name of the AP. The one on the left, it was on mezzanine, so I was on the top floor and slowly on the mezzanine, and then I put duct tape, so if they're using like carts and go on top of my pink ribbon, it's not gonna break it. In the picture, in the center picture, I'm not sure if you can see it, but you have the little pink ribbon on top. So if you're in this type of mezzanine, it's very narrow aisles and they all look the same. So when the installer would go through, he will be able to see right away where the AP location will be.
Yeah.
And on a map, it's easy to make a mistake from one aisle to another. Sometimes they don't all have like a number to be identified, so it's an easy way to avoid mistakes.
Yeah. Another feature of EcoHouse Site Surveys is, you can take a picture, like say the pink ribbon on the right there, you can take a picture of your survey, place it in there, and then I worked with a VAR once who just didn't want a picture. They want a picture, they wanted a description, and they wanted something mounted. So the description would be, let's say, 150 feet from the west wall, 200 feet from the north wall, on aisle D3. And so you've got a picture, you've got a description, and you've got a ribbon up there. So that may help most cable vendors in knowing where to accurately place the cable and where to accurately mount the Wi-Fi AP.
And then the third picture is actually under the ceiling, so you would need a skyjack to do that. So that takes a little bit of time. I don't do it all the time. Sometimes I have the time to do it and the skyjack available. So it depends, all right?
So design documentation, that's one of those things that we hate to do, okay? I mean, let me survey all day, but you got to do the paperwork, right? And I don't know if I've really seen a presentation of what you do for documentation, but this guy with SimFIO Networks has a nice little graphic on the side here, and so he might give you a few more tips on what the sheet looks like. But you need to put your design requirements. They need to be written down someplace so the client knows those, so you know those. Know about your heat maps, put that in. Put your layer 1 analysis in there as well. The details for the installer. So it may not just be for the client. The cable vendor may use the same document to know where to mount the APs. Put your appendices in there. Put some stuff about layer 1, layer 2. Maybe they will never read it, but you're putting that information in case the client wants to know a little bit more. And then, of course, make sure all the required required for the changes by the client. In case there's a change in the document process, you can put that and update your documentation. EcoHow has a great custom report, and that can help cable installers. You can pull that out of EcoHow Site Survey. And again, do this professionally. I mean, it's a PDF document, and they're paying quite a bit of money for this, but make sure your PDF document is well produced. It doesn't look junky. Make sure it's professional, so they'll have this document in their hands because they're paying some good money for this documentation.
Yes, I agree with that. At the end of the day, they're paying, when they hire you for a design, they're paying for a PDF file, so make sure it's worth it. Some other design considerations. Do you want to use?
Yeah, well, that's one question. I mean, more than anything, Francois, I mean, what about RRM? What about ARM, auto RF versus static channel and static powers? Yeah. I mean, what have you done in a warehouse in the past?
So I've had some issues with RRM in the past, where I would troubleshoot a customer and they'll have different issues. So I tend to use static planning now when I do my design for warehouses. You're spending time to do your sites, your AP on the stick, and make sure each access point will be able to be mounted in the proper way. So it's not going to take too long to do a static channel plan that makes sense for your environment. What about TX power?
Yeah, TX power. Yeah, what you said about your transmit power. You need to be careful about your antennas because your antennas will amplify that signal. So remember that, figure out what your amplification is with those antennas that you're using for survey work. So make sure that they're duplicating what what's more likely is your hand scanners, right? So be sure about the transmit powers. So the other question, what about DFS channels? Yes, no?
Well, I heard everyone uses DFS channels here yesterday. So you could use DFS channel in a warehouse. Just keep in mind that usually warehouses are close to airports, right? So you want to make sure you don't have too many DFS events. And also be careful with the client devices you have. Make sure they use the latest version of firmware. We'll talk about that later. And sometimes you'll find legacy devices in warehouses. Okay. So I've seen 11B devices in warehouses.
Yeah. Now, and what about roaming? I mean, roaming is a big thing in warehouses, right?
So you have a lot of mobility in the warehouse, the lift truck, the workers, the VoIP phones, and so on. So you want to keep roaming in mind when you do design. If in your design you have a couple of options for the AP location, just keep roaming in mind so you could find the best location according to how the workers are moving around the warehouse.
And data rates is always the discussion. I know what I have done, but what have you done in setting data rates? Do you disable low data rates, keep them enabled?
I usually use 6 as a minimum data rate. If I don't have any B clients, you get the B out of the way. Okay. You skip CCI.
Yeah, exactly, right. And then, there are new types of client devices, which we talked about. There's AGV robots, IoT. So it's not just the VoIP phone, and it's not just the hand scanners and things in warehouses, but there's new types of, one of my first site surveys I did had a robot line in there. And I had to, I got to make sure we have good coverage in this area.
Yeah, so this is coming up. We'll see. I think we'll see more and more IoT devices connecting to the Wi-Fi in warehouses. I've seen it for little devices used to monitor machinery and how they operate, so they can better use them. AGV, automated guided vehicles, they're coming up in warehouses as well. This is what you see on the first picture on the left. It's pretty much a lift truck without a driver. And then you have robots as well. You see them in distribution centers. I don't know if you've seen the video on the Amazon warehouse, but you'll see this type of devices. And they connect to the Wi-Fi, so I think this is new challenges for us in the future. So that's exciting.
So warehouse troubleshooting. I've talked with wireless engineers, and they'll say, it would be great to do a greenfield warehouse, but most of the design work that they have done is where they already have Wi-Fi deployed. So they're calling you to come in and fix their problem, So this is one of the most common things that we talk about. So there's a bit of a methodology here go through when you're doing troubleshooting. Start with the common questions, what are applications they're using? This isn't really unusual. We do this in other troubleshooting arenas as well, don't we? The types of devices used, the problem areas. But maybe in different some other verticals, walk with the end users, talk to them, get a feel for what kind of issues that they're seeing. And if you can do this, start off with a passive survey of the warehouse as a baseline. Maybe they have a survey that's 3 years old. Well, guess what? That was a survey 3 years ago. Probably things have changed in those 3 years. So start with another warehouse baseline, and then carry one of those problematic devices with you, like one of those hand scanners or something, and that will help you all. I talked with one engineer. He said they didn't give us enough hours to do a survey, and I said, what? You couldn't do a survey, so how did you know what coverage was like? Well, you had to go to the problem areas with the person. So if that happens to you and you can't do a baseline survey, do what you can, but I think the baseline survey will give you the best tool, the best diagnostics to find, okay, what's our next step in doing some troubleshooting.
So here we'll talk about the most common issues you'll find in warehouses: coverage holes, Wi-Fi driver issues, roaming issues, and AP antenna installation issues, right?
And this is a survey I did not too many months ago. Now, I can't tell you where this is, but it's close to South Beach, okay? Anyway, you can see a couple of coverage holes here. And again, this isn't really rocket science. So what would you do to help with those coverage holes? Well, add a couple of APs. And here I put a couple of APs with Cisco 2566 antennas on the side. And guess what? Voila, it covers. Nothing really unusual, but coverage area problems is one of the main things that you're going to be dealing with when you do troubleshooting in a warehouse.
Most of warehouses have been designed for 2.4 too, and sometimes they bring on 5 gig devices, and you find a lot of coverage holes. So again, when I say Wi-Fi driver issues in warehouses, what first comes to mind?
Wi-Fi driver issues. The first thing that comes to mind is this dreaded piece of equipment here. This is either the blessing or the bane of anyone working in Wi-Fi warehouses. How many times have I heard, if I had a nickel for every one time I heard someone say, my scanner's not working, my scanner's not working. So what do you do to fix those things? First of all, it's the firmware and the software. It's got to be updated. It's got to be updated. You will probably go to many warehouses, and if they say the scanner's not working, find out what the latest firmware and latest software is. And I and another engineer and another VAR at one time, they thought we were Supermen. We changed the firmware on their scanners, and guess what? They started to work. It's like, all you did was firmware upgrades, but they didn't know that, right? So that's like maybe number one on the list. Check all those scanners. They may have some type of an automated program. SODI is one of those that you can push firmware upgrades to scanners instead of doing one by one. See if they've got that. And then they may have scanners all over the board, 5 different models. Oh, just encourage them to try to 1 or 2 different model scanners, and that will help you as well. Determine the throughput connectivity of the scanning software. Usually they use Telnet to some type of a server, but you might have to check that on the back end. And then, I've done this as well. Open a TAC case with a vendor and ask them, hey, what are the best settings for your scanner for working in a warehouse scenario? And they may tell you, do this and this, because some of the settings on a scanner, says we know what they want. They may call band steering something flaky, so that's band steering, but they don't put that on the scanner, okay? We know by a different terminology. So open a TAC case with them, get a good feeling with one of the vendors that you're working with, and understand and get to them their best practices for settings of their scanners.
And one day I came across this application on the Intermec gun, and it was the best one I've ever used. I had all the information I needed to troubleshoot this client. I could do ping, I could see all the APs, I could see, it's pretty much an air check on the gun. So I was happy, and then I could walk around warehouses and check the signal and my connection, which channel I was connecting, and so on. So sometimes you could use the application directly on the gun to do some troubleshooting.
Yeah, and roaming issues is one of those big things, Francois, and you've had a big experience in how to set guns for setting roaming patterns.
Yeah, so they will have more options, different, you can adjust the roaming trigger and do some testing. So that's typically what I do. I would adjust the roaming trigger to do some testing. It doesn't take long to change one settings and then walk around the warehouses and make sure it works well. Also, some guns support Cisco CCX. If you have a Cisco infrastructure, this will improve the roaming if they support CCX version 4 and 5. So keep that in mind as well. And then for the AP installation issue, so on the left, on the right, you can see the antenna is not connected, right? It's not a big deal. In the center, the AP, it took me a while to find this AP. So it was sitting on top of the light. So from the ground, I could see some signal, but I couldn't see the AP. And so we used the Skyjack, and then the AP was there. And the last one, they missed an antenna again. And the other antennas are looking for the missing antenna, apparently.
Bad fi at a warehouse. What a surprise. Yeah. So when we talk warehouse troubleshooting, just a few additional tips. Channel utilization, and channel reuse, we know that. But channel utilization, how do you resolve that? Well, kind of bump down to the third one there. Do we selectively disable 2.4 gigahertz radios? Well, it depends, right? If that warehouse was designed for 2.4 and they really don't have the coverage for 5, you may have to just kind of deal with that, especially if they don't want to kind of work with you on a redesign. To me, I think we would all agree designing for 5 gigahertz makes sense, but there are some places that say, well, just make it work better. We may have to deal with code channel interference more than what we'd like to do. So you may not be able to selectively disable. Just a thing I heard from one of our wireless engineers this week, said if you're in the rack aisle areas, there's a good chance that you'll have to leave 2.4 enabled, because the racks actually perform attenuation for you, do they not? But if you're in the shipping or receiving area where it's more of an open area, you can maybe go through and selectively disable some of the 2.4 radios. Again, test, see if that works. But the other thing is this, it may not be a Wi-Fi issue at all you're dealing with. It may be an infrastructure issue. It may be a DNS, a DHCP latency issue. It may be their pipe size is really small. I was talking with someone, and he said he was working at a major manufacturing plant for soft drinks, and their pipe size for this huge factory was only 5 megabits per second. I go, what? And so there may be other issues. You may have to look at the pipes and see if they have any bandwidth clogs there. So those are some other tips that you can look at when you're doing warehouse troubleshooting.
So we have this little section thinking outside of the box. Warehouse is a great environment to try to find different options to meet your needs. So what about AP mounts? Do we always have to mount the AP from the ceiling?
Okay, well, that's a good question, Francois. Is the ceiling the only place that you can put an AP? Well, think with me, dream with me for a second. Where do you want the RF in a warehouse? You want it on the floor. Where do you want it? You want it where the person's having the hand scanner. They're sitting 4 or 5 feet up on a forklift. You want the RF down there, don't you? Well, you can get it from 40 feet up in the air, sure. But just think for me for a minute. If you had holes cut in the floor and you have your racking going east-west here, and you put APs in the floor with their antennas, you can put it and have analysis, sort of like this. But from time to time, they do change racks. I've talked with some engineers that, yeah, they change the racks from east, west, north, south on a regular basis. Like, you're kidding. So what do you do? He said, we have problems. We have to move APs up in the air. But if you do that, if they're mounted in the floor, then you just have to change where the positions of the APs are, okay? And so imagine what that would look like conceptually. You would have a box that would be cut in the floor, and you would have you would have conduit embedded in the floor, where you have a box, and you have your AP mount. And a little closer view of that, you will see that you have a lid on top. It says transparent lid, but think it's something that would support the weight of a forklift, okay? You have your antenna and you have your AP. Now, you're saying, Glenn, there's nobody doing that. I mean, that sounds nice, but no one's doing that, right? Au contraire. That's a little French I learned from Francois. There is someone who's doing this, and they have a conceptual model, and that's our friends at Ventiv. I love Ventiv because they want to work with the customer. Mike Perry, Dennis Burrell, Dennis is in the back there, you raise his hand. They met with me a few weeks ago, and they'll say, we are thinking about what we can do to put APs and antennas in the floor. I said, you're kidding. I thought I was the only other nutcase on this planet. He said, no, we're thinking about that. No, it's a conceptual model, but think about it. Your RF is in the floor where your users are. Does that not make sense? It may not be the answer for every warehouse, but it may be the answer for yours. So Mike Perry, Dennis Burrell, Ventiv, they're here. They would love to talk with you afterwards. So let's think as engineers thinking outside of the box.
For Mezzanine, sometimes you could use one AP to cover multiple floors. Right? So that's another way of thinking out of the box. One AP would cover both the lower and the upper floor, depending on the type of ceiling you have. Another way to think out of the box sector antenna, I got this one from Keith and Devon. So to cover aisles, it could be, it's like the perfect antenna pattern. Just if you use sector antenna, be careful. You'll have to install if the aisle is going that way, the sector antenna will be installed that way. So it's not intuitive, but that's just how the RF will propagate.
And we want to just say thank you for people who have helped make this survey possible or this presentation possible. There's so many different engineers out there. I interviewed Charlie Clemmer. He did something at Wireless LAN Professionals several years ago, and I asked, could I use some of your stuff? He said, do it, man. Just share with the people again. Stu Goomans, Wireless Stu, up in Canada, you had a chance to talk with him quite a bit. And this Francois guy, he just did a video not too long ago for APoAS, so check out that on YouTube. And above all, Francois, I think we want to thank our audience today, because if it wasn't for them who wanted to improve and have better Wi-Fi in warehouses, we'd just be speaking to an empty room. So thank you all for being here as well. So, now just before we go, we have a couple of other fun slides.
Yeah, so Glenn, what would be your dream warehouse?
Okay, if I had to dream, what warehouse would I like to survey? It would be this one, the Vehicle Assembly Building. Did you know, just a little details on here, it is the largest single-story building in the world. Yes, they built the Saturn V there in the space shuttle. They're also going to be constructing the new space launch system for Orion going to Mars. Yay, let's go to Mars. It is 526 feet tall, 160 meters, 716 feet long, 157 meters. It covers 8 acres, which is 3 hectares of land. They have 4,200 steel rods driven into the ground 160 feet, because we have these things called hurricanes in Florida, okay? It is incredible. So, Francois, the only thing I can say about, I might need a Skyjack in there to lift up my AP for testing.
You might need a drone.
Yeah. Okay, so that's my dream. Francois, what is your dream?
I would have loved to design the Gigafactory. I've heard everything is neat and all the dark areas in between the floors, so I'm wondering how they did the Wi-Fi. So maybe one of you guys designed the Wi-Fi.
And lastly?
Yeah, to circle back to the definition of a warehouse, warehouse is also a place where you could find very old stuff, like this vending machine I saw one day. I took a picture, and I'm thinking I need to include that in the presentation. So.
And it doesn't take Bitcoin. Yeah.
It doesn't take Bitcoin.
Okay. Well, Francois, I just want to thank you again for all the work you put into this presentation. This was awesome, so I really appreciate working with you.
Thank you.
I don't know if we've ever done a team teaching here for Wireless LAN Professionals, but it was fun working with you off-site, and it's been a great presentation. I appreciate your help.
Thank you, Glenn.
Okay. Thank you all.